Welcome to Semantic Backup Exec 2012 Virtual Machine Conversion. We are in Lesson 8. In this lesson, we'll discuss virtual machine conversion fundamentals. What are we talking about when we talk about virtual machine conversion to begin with? So we'll explain that. We'll describe the supported conversion configurations. We'll go through the various options that are available to you to do virtual conversions. And we'll talk about the workflows necessary to do those conversions. So let's start with the basics, the fundamentals for converting virtual machines. As far as terminology goes, you will see P to V. That means that we're going to take a physical machine, back it up, and as that backup is running, simultaneously with the backup, we will also convert to a virtual machine. So you will, as the backup is running, you will wind up with a VMDK or VHD file, depending on whether you are converting to ESX or Hyper-V. Backup to virtual, or B to V, means that we're going to run the backup, and at some point after the backup is finished, you can schedule, if you choose to, the conversion to a virtual machine. So P to V means that as the backup is running, we create a virtual machine. B to V means that we complete the backup, and at some point that you schedule, we will convert that backup to a virtual machine. PIT is point in time, so if you're running some simplified disaster recovery backups on a regular basis, you can click on any one of those backups at any point in time and say, take this existing backup and convert it to a virtual machine. So I don't have to do the virtual machine conversions on a regular basis. I can do them on an on-demand basis by using one of my point-in-time backups that is simplified disaster recovery enabled. The P2V source is the physical machine that we run the backup from and also do the conversion. The P2V target is the virtual environment to which the virtual machine will be written. We support Hyper-V and VMware. Simplified disaster recovery, SDR, must be enabled to do any physical to virtual conversions or any backup to virtual conversions. That is an entirely separate lesson, but it does have to be enabled in order to do these conversions. To convert virtual machines, you must be running either Hyper-V or VMware. We can convert to a VHD file for Hyper-V or a VMDK file for VMware. The source has to be a running physical machine or an existing simplified disaster recovery backup set. And if it is an SDR backup, I can do a backup to virtual, or I can do a point-in-time virtual conversion. The end result of whether it's a P2V, a B2V, or a point-in-time is a virtual machine that is already placed on the host and ready to be powered on. So the supported virtual platforms are VMware and Hyper-V. So backup to virtual is the process of converting existing backup sets, where physical to virtual is simultaneously backing up the physical box and doing the virtual conversion. One data source can write to multiple targets. So in the case of a physical to virtual, a P2V, I am backing up the server, writing it to the backup exec server, but at the same time converting that physical server to a virtual machine and writing the virtual machine to the hypervisor host, either VMware or Hyper-V. So I can have multiple targets as this operation happens. The main job requirement is that simplified disaster recovery must be enabled. So I must have the minimum components to do SDR, usually the C drive and system state being backed up, And you'll see in the backup job that simplified disaster recovery is turned on. We can only do conversions for backups that have been written to disk. If your backups are written to tape, we cannot convert those to virtual machines. They must be written to disk to do virtual machine conversions. So we support VMware, ESX 4.0 and later, which includes ESXi 4.0 or later, and Hyper-V in Server 2008 or Server 2008 R2. To do VMware, you have to be ESX 4.0 or later, and will support any of the pieces that are newer, including ESX 5 and the different hardware layers that are included in that. For Hyper-V, you must be on Server 2008 Service Pack 2 or Server 2008 R2 on the Backup Exec server. So the Backup Exec server itself must be Windows Server 2008 or Server 2008 R2. The agent for Windows must be installed on the Hyper-V host to which the conversions are being sent. It should also be there because you're going to back up the Hyper-V host. So you must have the agent on that Hyper-V host. The maximum disk size of any of the virtual conversions or the guests that will be on that Hyper-V host is 2 terabytes. 2 terabytes. That's a limitation in Hyper-V. To the different options that are available to you to do virtual conversions. If I'm doing physical to virtual, P2V is always done in parallel with a backup job. What this means is that you will write at the speed of the slowest function. So if I'm doing a backup and a conversion at the same time, it can only go as fast as the slowest function. These will always keep the same disk configurations. So I can't change this after the fact. If I backed up from a 40 gig C drive, it will be a 40 gig C drive when it is converted to a virtual machine. It only supports full backup methods, and a full conversion results in a new virtual machine or new virtual disks. It does require that all the critical resources are selected and that simplified disaster recovery is turned on. For error handling, backup is the primary task. We really are focused on that backup completing and hopefully successfully. The backup will continue even if the conversion fails. If the backup fails, the conversion will also fail. So if the conversion fails during the backup will continue to run if it is all possible for that backup to run. The conversion is skipped for the remaining data, and the job is marked as a failed job. The conversion process will not attempt to run again until the next full backup. So if you run your full backups on the weekend and run partial backups like incrementals or differentials during the week, and a conversion job fails, it will not run again until the following weekend when the next full backup runs. If a physical server should fail and you switch over to the virtual machine that has been created as a result of this conversion process, Backup Exec detects that, and when it backs up the virtual machine, it will no longer try to convert it. So it detects that you have failed over to the virtual machine, and any conversion jobs that are listed will keep failing because it knows that it can't overwrite the new virtual machine with a conversion. So you'll see failed jobs at that point. When I do backup to virtual conversion, this is I let my backup finish, and then as another stage in my backup definition, I tell it that I want it to do a conversion of that backup. So I can only convert backups that have simplified disaster recovery enabled. It runs after the backup has finished. You can schedule when that runs. It can run immediately after the backup has finished or schedule it to run later. I can only do this through a backup definition. So backup to virtual is done as a stage in the backup definition. And these are linked only to full backups. I cannot do backup to virtual conversions of either incremental or differential jobs. Scheduling the job is probably the best in most scenarios. Rather than running a physical to virtual conversion and letting it run at the speed of the slowest function, I can run the backup, allow it to finish, and then later do the conversion to virtual when it will be not interfering with other backup jobs and not slowing down other backup jobs. So scheduling allows you a lot more versatility. This is a graphic of what I was describing earlier, that I have one data source that is writing to multiple targets. So the server that I'm backing up, that is in the upper right corner of this screenshot, my application server, is writing backup data to the backup exec server through the agent, but it is also being converted to a virtual machine and being written to the virtual host environment, either VMware or Hyper-V. The backup exec server is still maintaining a connection to both the server being backed up and the virtual host environment. So there's lots of communication going on here. This can be relatively network intensive if you're trying to run everything at one time. Limitations to doing conversions. We can only convert Windows servers. So if you are backing up a Linux or a Macintosh server, we cannot do a conversion to virtual for you. We only support basic disks. Dynamic disks are not supported for conversion. And in VMware, the supported disk size is defined by the block size of the data store. So if your data store will allow you to write larger blocks, you can create larger disks. In Hyper-V, 2 terabytes is the limit of the disk size. If you are running Microsoft Small Business Edition and you're running Backup Exec Small Business Edition on that Microsoft Small Business server, Hyper-V is the only supported virtual target environment. We do not support VMware in that environment. We support B2V and P2V, so you can do either one. The backup exec server needs to be Server 2008, and the Hyper-V role must be enabled so that we can get the ISO that puts the guest tools in the guest. Let's take a look at the workflows. How do I define my backup so that it will do this virtual conversion? So let's start with physical to virtual. If I go to the Backup and Restore tab, under Backup, we're going to say Backup to Disk and simultaneously convert to virtual machine. So this is a P2V. Later we'll take a look at a B2V, or running a scheduled conversion after the backup completes. So if we're running a physical to virtual, you will see the machine that you are backing up and all of the volumes that have been selected. In your schedules you can see full and incremental, and you will see another stage that says simultaneously convert that to a virtual machine. I must have the full system protection enabled, so I have to be backing up the C and the system state. If you create this kind of a backup where I told it to do that from the beginning, what you'll notice here is that C and system state cannot be deselected. They're automatically marked for you. You can deselect non-critical components, but if you want to do this conversion, the C and system state at a minimum must be included in the backup. So they're automatically marked and you can't turn that off. In the conversion settings then, I am allowed to say that I want to convert this to either ESX for VMware or Hyper-V. If it is ESX, you have to provide a logon account that has rights to write the VMDK file to the ESX server. When you point it at the ESX or vCenter server, it should automatically populate the data center, the data store, and the host cluster for you. Best practice here is to point this at the vCenter server and let the vCenter server route the VMDK to the appropriate ESX host, especially if you're using vMotion. The virtual machine options that you see, by default, Backup Exec is going to name the virtual machine VM-BE- whatever the host name was of the machine that's being converted. So it will reflect the original host from which this backup was run and converted to a virtual machine. By default, it will also overwrite the virtual machine. So my regular weekly full backup will create a new virtual machine but overwrite the old one every week when that full backup runs. You must also provide the full path to VMware tools so that it can put the tools into the new virtual machine as it is being created. Down at the bottom you see the configuration. You can set the RAM, the CPU, and we'll take a look at the disk configuration for your new virtual machine as it's being created. So if I look at disk configuration, it will show me the same configuration as the host from which we're converting, but you can certainly come in and change that. So I can change the controller, I can change whether it is a thick or a thin provisioned machine, and I can specify the path for the virtual disk. If we're going to be going to Hyper-V, so we're going to do a physical to virtual conversion to Hyper-V, then the Backup Exec server must be 64-bit. And the target system has to be Server 2008 R2. I can do a warm standby, so in my virtualization options you have to say create a virtual machine for Hyper-V. The type of conversion is going to be a virtual machine. I have to give it the path to the Hyper-V server. This should be a UNC path. You can select it by browsing, but it should be a UNC path. I must also provide a login account for what account has rights to write the VHD file to that Hyper-V host. Again, the virtual machine name is selected for you automatically based on the host from which the conversion is being taken. It will overwrite just like we saw in VMware, so that every full backup will create a new virtual machine and overwrite the old one. And you must provide the path to the ISO for the tools to be included in the virtual machine as it's being converted. Again, you can set the physical RAM and the CPU count of your new virtual machine, and you can configure the disks. So I can say the controller, it will automatically select for that Hyper-V host, and I can say the disk type. For backup to virtual, this is the scheduled conversion. In this case, they're taking your P2V that we just looked at and we're adding a stage to convert an existing backup to a virtual machine. This is not something that you would do in production, but the point of this screenshot is to allow you to see the difference. So I have said I want to back up semantic-7C2981, and I'm going to do a full backup. And when I add a stage to do a conversion, you'll notice that the source is the full, that we can only do conversions of full, and because it is an added stage, it is now a B2V. Down at the bottom is the P2V that was created when we said that we wanted to do a simultaneous backup and conversion. Most times you would not do both. Pick one or the other. When we do a convert to virtual as a B2V, you can then schedule when the conversion happens. So I get to use the full speed of the backup. Remember, these backups must go to disk. So I get the fastest backup I possibly can, and then I can schedule this conversion to happen outside of my backup window. So I'm not slowing any backups down by doing this conversion. So I can tell it the schedule, or I can say immediately after the backup completes, do the conversion. If you want it to run on a calendar, you can do that as well. The conversion settings are the same as we've seen in the past with the other jobs. I can also take an existing backup set, so I'm running full backups on a regular basis, and now all of a sudden I need a virtual machine, or I want to test restore my full backups. So what I can do is highlight any full backup, click on the convert button, and it will convert to virtual from that point in time backup. So this is a great way to do test restores to make sure that what you're backing up can be used either in a virtual world, or you could restore it to physical if you knew that everything was working virtually. When I tell it to do a point in time, this is a convert to virtual. You can schedule this as well. Typically this is done as a run now. The only backups that are eligible to be done as point-in-time virtual machine conversions are those that were simplified disaster recovery enabled at the time the backup ran. And it will show you that you have to convert at least the critical components. In this case, the F drive had something important on it. It could have been that an application had been installed to that F drive. In this case, we're looking at Exchange with an information store. You'll also notice that the data that was on the F drive is not being included. Just the Exchange components that were on the F drive are being included, and then that you could then restore the information store in this example as a separate installation, as a separate restore. So we have talked about the basic components and the basic concepts of virtual machine conversion, that a P2V runs simultaneously with a backup, that a B2V, a backup to virtual, runs as a scheduled thing after the backups have completed, that we can convert to either Hyper-V or VMware, and we've talked about the different options that you have available to you for this virtual conversion, and the process and workflows for allowing these backups and conversions to take place.